It's all really nice to have you all here. It's really great to see the lively conversation that takes place before class, during class, and after class, and we really appreciate that. So today we're shifting gears slightly. As we began the class, Dr. Uno provided a structure, looked at the Asian religions, began asking some questions about the function of religion in life and relating it to human services. Today we're going to slightly shift and talk about the concept of religious pluralism. And I'll go for about 55 minutes, then we'll take a break. And then President Lariviere will come and talk about his experiences both with Hinduism, Sanskrit, Dharma, karma, these concepts. And then we'll begin some short small group activities, after 6 o'clock-ish. We'll have opportunities within this lecture also to stop and talk with each other about these ideas. So, religious pluralism. So what is pluralism? It's an energetic engagement with religions or faiths that are different than your own. And the idea of pluralism is timely for us because it calls for, instead of a more passive concept of diversity, where we just kind of tolerate people and hopefully not oppress them or marginalize them, pluralism argues that we need to actively engage in the dialogue about these traditions, again with the idea of fostering understanding, appreciation, and the development of meaningful relationships. The Pluralism Project at Harvard University was developed in the early 1990s, and I think we've got that website in our syllabus, and I would encourage you all to take a look at this. And one of the reasons it's interesting is because it takes all of the great or major religious traditions in the world and describes their development here in the United States. Describes, for example, the process that religious traditions from, say, Islam or the Hindu faith or Buddhism, how they've come to America and how they've begun to grow, develop, and connect both to people within their faith traditions, but also into the community in general. And it was amazing to me to read this website because I was unaware of the sheer magnitude of the development that's taking place in this country that really seems to be below the surface. And it was very exciting to, for example, read how the different traditions go about the process of developing their temples, their communities, their places of worship, and the great pride that they have in setting these things up, and some of the challenges they experience in terms of getting this temple or a religious center together. Again, pluralism is about seeking understanding. And so the understanding, there must be a spot for you, yes. Seeking understanding across lines of religious difference. And the idea of pluralism is really more of an extra-dimensional understanding. Historically, in America, we've always talked about fostering understanding within the intra-dimension of Christianity, that we would understand the different members of the Protestant faiths or the Roman Catholic faiths or the Orthodox faiths, the different intra, meaning within, the intra-dimension of Christianity. Pluralism really is taking it to the extra-dimensional, outside your faith tradition to one of the larger worldwide faith traditions. So it's very important from that perspective to also prepare yourself in terms of your own understanding, and that dialogue then becomes one of sharing. The authors of the website, Professor Diana Eck from Harvard University, writes prolifically on this idea of pluralism as something that it's important that while you're engaging and while you're connecting, that you hold on to your own religious or faith traditions in a way that promotes the idea of dialogue versus just holding on to it yourself and only sharing it with people of your same tradition. So the idea is about relationship, building relationship with people who you ordinarily may not connect with because you sense some differences that you don't understand. And so as the Pluralism Project has evolved, it has begun to develop curriculum materials that aid individuals in this process of seeking relationship, engaging with individuals and organizations from other religious or faith traditions, and then really seeking an understanding. In Eugene, this process has been ongoing for about 15 years. There's an interreligious organization that sponsors different activities on a regular basis. Carrie and I had the opportunity to visit their prayer breakfast back in, I think, September, wasn't it? In September. And it was so interesting to be in this little town of Eugene and then to see all of the different religious organizations represented both by leaders of these faiths, but also by individuals who are simply participants or members of this faith. And that's where we heard President Lariviere give his speech on karma and Dharma, and hopefully he reprises the finest elements of that today. But again, in Eugene, they have regular, I think quarterly events, and then also events that take place at pivotal times in the calendar, and also events in response to crises that may develop. And so the leadership of this is very much pluralistic in the sense that major religions are all represented in this particular activity. Are there any questions about the concept of pluralism, how it operates, how it's defined?
I just want to ask if will this be posted so we can listen
This
to
is
instead
posted.
of writing?
This is posted under course documents in Blackboard.
Okay.
To clarify my understanding, I'm getting a sense that pluralism is not just having an understanding of other religious traditions, but what you do with that understanding as far as not just necessarily studying another religion in a textbook, but going and speaking with a person who identifies with Hinduism or various other religions, and then making connections.
That is the basis of it, is a conscious, proactive interaction around the differences and similarities that exist within your tradition and their tradition. So it's not a passive study, so to speak. It's really an active process. The concept, it's energetic. It's proactive.
So then, is there any practicing of each other's faiths, or?
Not necessarily. Let me give you an example. When the group comes together in Eugene, usually you'll have a variety of representatives from different traditions offering a prayer in their tradition, so that you would experience it, understand it, feel it, and then as part of that ongoing dialogue, what you're doing is you're appreciating and understanding these similarities. Not that you're trying to, try out something, to see how it fits, so to speak. That's not the purpose of it. It's really more of an engagement and the concept is interpersonal dialogue around this particular important element of faith, spirituality, religious tradition, etc. So it's not a trying on, it's really more of a sharing to let people know how it is that you pray or you worship or you engage in human services. And that's, of course, the purpose of this class, is to try to get a sense of how the different traditions view human services. That's our goal.
I'm seeing pluralism as sort of a model to build those networks, and I'm assuming that many people are practicing pluralism on their own by, like what Jenny said, by making relationships and seeking information. But I like the style that Eugene has in terms of there's actually like a format for it, and there's a place where you can go to experience this. How frequently is that occurring? And I'm assuming those people are then going back to their own communities and expanding on what they've learned.
Yes. Well, we'll have Rabbi Yitzhak Henkin here, and we'll also have Ibrahim, two of the key leaders. And so we can ask them that question. I know of it simply because I'm on their mailing list. So I hear about their different activities. But you're right, there is a structure to it. There is a process to it. There's an opportunity. For example, one of the key times they have it is around Thanksgiving. And so that particular timing piece. And so all of the different traditions, including Native American traditions, come and then share. Or around the solstice times, or around the time that Christians celebrate Easter and Ramadan. So there are different key times that are very sacred periods for the different religions, where then an interfaith pluralistic event occurs, usually around a theme, Thanksgiving, prayer, etc. But the thing that's nice about this is that the Pluralism Project actually proposes different activities that groups can engage in to foster this level of understanding. So it's not just kind of a passive, willy-nilly kind of activity. It's very conscious, planned, and that is what's fostering, in many cases, greater appreciation and relationship development.
To my knowledge, they gather once a month.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on the 11th of every month. And it's in commemoration of the September 11th attacks. So the intention is to show.
So that was.
It's in commemoration. It's to show, hey, different faiths can come together and live harmoniously. It's on 12th and Oak in the First Christian Congregation Church, and it's really powerful.
And are there many other communities nationwide or around the world that are taking on this model and using it the way we do this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's emotional.
It's a growing movement, and again, it's being tracked by the people in the Pluralism Project at Harvard University.
Is it just the engagement and dialogue, or is it also like a mixture of religions? Can one person say that pluralism is that I am a person who is many faith? Can that mean the same?
You know, I think that maybe some people may approach it that way, but the true concept of pluralism is, again, this notion of holding on to your religious or faith tradition while you're in relationship with others. I'm certain there must be people who, and we'll see some of the statistics on people who do have multiple ways that they express themselves religiously or spiritually. But I think the pluralism concept is really within the major traditions. And if you look at the website, you'll see, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Jainism, all the major traditions showing up in that, and showing how each of those groups are facilitating activities such as this.
So, to my understanding, I kind of like the word pluralism, but what my question is, as young professionals, and I think many of us, we're going to be working, with people with different religious backgrounds, but mostly Christian sometimes, especially in the States. So how do we explain, or how do we deal with people? Because sometimes we're learning this right now, but people outside, they might not understand. How do we create awareness of pluralism with our clients? you know, especially right now in times where you know, there's this very rigid kind of, you know, environment about, you know, religion here in the States. So how do, as a professional, and if I find someone, you know, maybe not understanding other religions, how do we do it?
My understanding is that they haven't gotten there yet. And we're just slightly ahead of the curve to begin thinking about this from the human service perspective. So I would offer to you that while these techniques are strictly personal and interpersonal, they would begin to, I think, show us some of the key activities or mechanisms or opportunities and challenges that could occur to you know, basically implement or engage in some of the things that you've talked about. I'm not aware of any formal activity in this particular area. At least Carrie and I looked and we didn't see any. So what we're trying to do is to again introduce these concepts and then begin working with them to achieve the dream or the ideal that you've expressed.
Yeah, I kind of forgot about that. It's like, okay, we can really.
Let's move there quickly. You know, let's okay, we got an idea. Let's get a curriculum going. Let's move. And that's part of the idea is we're still thinking it through, but the Pluralism Project is this group that's really tracking how is this working. The idea, and Jenny made note of the September 11th event, and this actually these events had preceded that. They're you know, I've been going to the events for at least the last 25 years, and so, but the 9/11 I think fostered a kind of critical mass, and the group grew fairly dramatically in response to that. So, and plus it coincided with the Pluralism Project beginning to support different groups and giving ideas and mechanisms. So it's a pretty exciting concept. Any other questions?
I was just going to ask, what is the main goal for that organization, like long-term goal?
For Pluralism?
Uh-huh.
The original mission is interfaith dialogue, appreciation, relationship development. You know, I mean, they're trying to frame it in a positive concept instead of to, you know, prevent conflict. Mm-hmm. You know, but they're really, the idea is that in this country especially, we're seeing dramatic growth, not in terms of whole numbers, but in terms of percentages of groups that are becoming far more pluralistic within our country, as our immigration laws encourage different individuals from India and from China and from other countries, Central America, Mexico, beginning to have much more diversity in our religious faiths, as opposed to the way it was, say, even 50 years ago. So, why is pluralism important? If we could just spend a couple minutes with each other, you know, dyads if possible, and just discuss between each of you why pluralism in religion is important to a community, and then to get to Pedro's question, or a variation of Pedro's question, what role do human service professionals play in promoting pluralism? And so let's take 5 minutes and break up into dyads and discuss these two issues and get a sense of how people are thinking about this, having been introduced to it this afternoon. Okay? So, why is pluralism important? Hopefully we'll have a chance to debrief that in a bit. So now I want to give you a kind of a picture of the religions of the world. Now this is based on the 2005 Encyclopedia of World Religions, and you'll see some interesting statistics here. And the way it's organized is looking at Christianity and whether it's growing, stable, or dropping. And so Christianity is the largest religion in the world with 2,039,000,000 adherents, which is roughly 32% of the world, primarily North America, South America, Europe, parts of Africa, and small little enclaves in Asia. Islam, 1,570,000,000, 22% of the world, and the fastest growing of the large world religions. Centered in the Middle East, but also in Indonesia, parts of Asia, and again, one of the areas that is experiencing growth primarily, it's interesting to note that Christianity is located in certain countries that have low birth rates, Europe, North America, and also in countries with higher birth rates, South America, Central America, and parts of Africa. So they're balancing themselves out, but the dominant Christian, European, North American dropping because of birth rate, whereas Islam, all around the world where Islam exists, it's growing, primarily because of birth rate. Hinduism, which is primarily located on the Indian subcontinent, about 950 million adherents, 13% of the world population, and very stable. Very stable in the sense that while their birth rate is growing in the south, it's stabilized in the north. So you have roughly a stable, not fast-growing religion. Now, it's interesting. The fourth largest religion of the world is none. 775 million adherents when they're asked the question, what is your religious affiliation? None. It's dropping slightly. And again, that is primarily North America, Europe, parts of Africa, parts of Asia, and in China. Now, the Chinese folk religions, 390 million, are mostly state. Ma'am?
When you say none, do you mean this 775 million people are atheists, or they just don't identify with a religion, or just a combination of both?
Both.
Okay.
Both. Yes. But atheism is included in the none category. Agnosticism, atheism, and just not identifying with any. So, for example, in the Chinese folk religion, which includes ancestral worship, that is considered a religion because it has many of the characteristics of religion, of prayer, altars, blessings, etc. So very large group of people in Southeast Asia, very strongly affiliated with the Chinese folk religion. And that's stable. Now the next one I thought was very interesting because Buddhism, 350 to 1,600,000,000. Why do you think that is such a, with the other ones being so kind of concrete and clear, what's happening with Buddhism that would have such a large range of potential adherents?
Well, as Mark Uno spoke about, there's a lot of different forms or variations or subgroups of Buddhism, so I'm wondering if that number is including all these different forms.
Could be. It could be. The typical theory is that China and North Vietnam, both communist nations, do not identify or acknowledge any religion. So because that's a big number, 1,600,000,000, big number. So it leads you to think China, it leads you to think Vietnam. So that's why, but those countries are historically Buddhist. Although there's small enclaves of Christianity in Vietnam, primarily they've been a Buddhist tradition in Vietnam and in China. Tribal religions, which are all over Oceania, parts of Africa, in parts of South America, shamanism, animism, prehistory, still a very large group of people who identify with this particular religious tradition. Judaism, less than 1%. Less than 1%. Primarily, but distributed all throughout the world. But you see then, 14.5 million in the entire world, less than 1%. And again, China and Vietnam officially have no religion.
I have a question on the Buddhism. So they only, you have a question mark on stable. So why is it?
Well, because there are no official statistics kept. Remember, this is a study that was done in 2005 by a British demographer. And as he went around the world, he sampled different communities and there's been a historic encyclopedia which documents world religions, and it's been fairly predictable since the 1890s. But because of the notion of China and Vietnam being communist nations, see, because remember, in Russia also, 40% of Russians are part of that no religion, whereas historically Russia was Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. But with communism, they banned religion. And so, but as you see what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union, all the religions in Eastern Europe and Bulgaria and in Ukraine and Russia and all those countries, Poland, they're all now 97% religious affiliations. So while the communist nations prevented or prohibited religion, it still was underground. And that's what's probably happening in China. It's underground, it's not official, and so people are not able to collect those statistics.
I just want to throw out something that I heard. I was in Israel over winter break, and the impression that I got when I was there is that Judaism is dropping actually, because it's worldwide. It's in Israel, obviously. That's a Jewish state, but it's dropping in part because of the Holocaust and the 6 million people that died, and the generations of people that were lost there that couldn't pass on the tradition, and also because of the fear of Jewish people who went across the world who were afraid to claim that they were Jewish. Mm-hmm. So the impression I got is that it's slowly
Thank you for sharing that. I've heard that too. So that's why it's not dropping, it's just stable. Religion in the United States. Protestant denominations, 51% of adults, and that's defined as people over the age of 18, identify themselves as Protestant, 51%. 3 fairly distinct religious traditions, and within the Protestant, it's the evangelical Protestant churches, about 26% of the adult population in the United States. Those would be your Baptist, Assemblies of God, holiness bodies, Foursquare, a tradition that's uniquely American. Although the evangelical movement is occurring very strongly in parts of Central and South America, it's a uniquely American phenomenon. Whereas your mainline Protestant churches, Lutheranism, Methodism, Congregational, Presbyterian, all of those, represent about 18%. It's interesting, the evangelical Protestant churches are growing, the mainline Protestant churches are declining. And then you have your historically black Protestant churches, which are predominantly in the South, the Methodist tradition being the strongest. Roman Catholics, 24% of U.S. Adults, and among foreign-born Americans, Catholics outnumber Protestants almost 2 to 1. So you can see that many of the new immigrants coming to the country, more Catholic than Protestant. 1/4 of American adults have left the faith they were raised in favor of another religion or no religion at all. So you see that people being born into a religion doesn't necessarily mean that you stay in that religion here in the United States. That's almost unheard of in other countries. If you remember what Mark talked about, it's much more than just an affiliation. It's a cultural, historical, familial, tribal connection, versus in the United States, which tends to have more of a sense of affiliation, joining, participating. Among Americans 18 to 29, 1 in 4 say they are not currently affiliated with any particular religion. And as Mark mentioned in his lecture last week, the Northwest is the most unaffiliated of any of the regions in the United States. Approximately 25-26% of Oregonians identify and affiliate with a specific religion, about the same for the state of Washington. So we're numbers 1 and 2, or 49 and 50, however you want to look at it, in terms of religious affiliation. We also have a lower age in our state. Catholicism has experienced the greatest net losses as a result of affiliation changes. 31% of individuals identified themselves as raised in the Catholic faith, but today among adults, fewer than 24% describe themselves as Roman Catholic. So we're seeing a dramatic change in that particular religion here in the United States. And in some cases, they are reaffiliating with Protestant churches, and in some cases, basically non-affiliating at all. 12.1% of the adult population is made up of people who simply describe their religion as nothing in particular in the United States. So, you know, I'm assuming that some of you can relate pretty clearly to that particular phenomena. Jews identify with one of 3 major groups: Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. So you see within Judaism you have 3 distinct groups, like you have in Protestantism 3 distinct groups. Likewise, Buddhists, half of Buddhists belong to one of the 3 major groups within Buddhism: Zen, Theravada, or Tibetan, whereas Muslims are organized primarily into 2 groups: Sunni and Shia. Nearly 1 in 5 men say they have no formal religious affiliation, compared to 13% of women. Why is that? What do you think is going on with a gender difference in terms of religious affiliation? What do you think about that?
I think like women has a sense of commitment more than men. I don't know, but that's how I feel. And then the second point, I see that men don't want to be under some kind of leadership. Church has strong leadership. Some men just...
When I asked this question to a couple of my friends, they said, well, it's because men like to watch football on Sundays. I can't imagine that that's the case. Among people who are married, nearly 4 in 10 are married to a spouse with a different religious affiliation. That is a significant change that's occurred in the United States, primarily since the 1950s. Prior to the 1950s, people tended to marry within their religious groups, and now we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of people who marry outside their religious traditions. Just a couple of interesting statistics. The South has the most members of evangelical Protestant churches. The Northeast has the most Roman Catholics. The West, the most unaffiliated agnostics and atheists. So we have an interesting identity out here in the West.
What is the difference between an atheist and an agnostic?
An atheist is a person who actively doesn't believe in God, and an agnostic, I think the agnostic simply is not interested in that process, whereas the atheist is adamantly opposed to it on theoretical and personal grounds. The agnostic is, I don't really care. So what I'd like to do now is to just reflect back on the concept of pluralism. What kinds of ideas did you come up with as you discussed that question?
I'd like to ask you a question. Is atheism, can can that be called like a religion of its own?
That's the point of it is that they have a scientific almost principle about the disbelief in God. That maybe they believe in science or some other process, but they do not believe that God is this universal spiritual construct that is moving behind events or processes that know it's science or something like that. Pedro.
So, I have friends, but they believe in aliens.
In who?
Aliens, like they're like.
Oh, aliens.
No, and it's it's kind of like, I mean, I'm fine with that, but but the thing is that they're, is that considered a religion? Because like they're like always saying that some star's gonna come.
Where would you put that in our list?
I have no idea.
How about none? I mean, I'm thinking of it from the perspective of a researcher that comes to a group of people and says, okay, which of these religions are you? And they say, alien. I worship aliens. I would imagine that they would be stuck in the none category.
I think, are they Scientologists?
Yeah.
Is that what they, do you know?
I have no clue. They just talk
That
about
would be
stars.
my guess.
They just talk about stars and something.
Scientology is an actual formal religion and is in the statistics of our. So I didn't look at Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientology. So there are numerous groups like that, and so they are very small percentages, but they still represent 30, 40, 50, 100, 200,000 people.
I'm
So
guessing that's
they would be considered the non-then.
Probably not, because I didn't see Alien in the group, but I did see Scientology, I did see Jehovah's Witness, I did see other groups.
Can I just ask a really basic question?
Yeah.
As far as the definition of religion goes, does it imply the belief in God? Is it a synonym for God? I mean,
well,
belief.
Yes and no. Not all of them are deist. So, for example, if you look at animism,
Which I have no idea what that is.
Yeah. Describe the tribal religions if you can, because
pardon?
describe the tribal religions.
So tribal religions are shamanism, animism, prehistory. I mean, Chinese folk religions such as ancestral worship. So they're not deistic. Now,
Deistic being the belief in God.
Deistic, is it tends to be associated with the major traditions. Theistic, deistic. Remember how Mark talked about theology as theo, God.
Yeah.
And so many of these religions do not posit a God. So you have deists or theists, and then you have other, which would include, again, ancestral, animist, shamanist. Shamanists are they believe in some kind of darkest, spiritual forces. So no, they do not all believe in God, that a God exists. So back to our question here.
Would you like me to read the definition of religion?
Pardon?
Would you like me to read the definition of religion?
Yeah, we have definitions for all these things. Go ahead. Shamanism.
Oh, this is just religion. Just the word religion. The belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. Capital God, lowercase gods. Details of belief as taught or discussed, a particular system of faith and worship, a pursuit or interest to which someone ascribes supreme importance.
So everything would fit into that we've discussed here, except for none. Thank you. Why is pluralism important to a community? What did you guys come up with? What does it do for a community to have this active engagement? Tara?
I think it creates an understanding and almost like in my mind, like a harmonious way of living. if people are actively standing up and saying, I want to understand what you're doing and what you're practicing, and at the end of the day, not saying, now I believe in it, but saying, okay, and now we can move, but go on with our lives and not challenge each other's beliefs so much.
And not inadvertently say or do things that are especially hurtful.
Yeah. So it allows it to almost get, I don't know, it can change vocabulary, it can change how people interact with each other, how they're going to react when people bring up their own religions if you have an understanding of them.
Good, thank you. What are some other ideas that came up?
We kind of talked about how, at least in society in the United States, people tend to kind of be really passionate about like their beliefs or where they came from or what they do, kind of like a lot about themselves. They're really passionate about, what they've learned kind of since they're a child oftentimes, and how pluralism really like evokes this idea of you can hold on to your own beliefs, but also still respect and really be interested in other people's. And I think that that's like a really important thing that should, be happening a lot more.
Is that me? Everybody knows I'm teaching class today at this time.
I happen to mark too, so don't feel bad.
Well, there's only one person that rings that way, and that's my wife. She'll text me, and it'll be okay. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was feeling a sense of respect for people from different corners of the world where you have your religion and your faith, but at the same time, you treat other people as human beings. You don't reject them, you don't push them. You also get to learn the culture, how they live. So usually religion becomes this like a clash of where I don't want to be close to you, you are like blasphemy and things like that. So if you are in a community where you have a respect of other people who don't believe like you, that brings peace in the community, than conflict.
Very nicely said. I'll go to Tara, and then I'll go to...
You can go to her first.
Monet?
I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I was going to say it's very, very similar. I think in my eyes what pluralism would do in a community is by learning about what really speaks to me about this is the coming together not in preventing conflict, but rather in understanding and respecting each other.
Yeah.
So that idea in and of itself says, just by understanding that action itself will prevent conflict. But we're not coming for that reason. We're coming to respect and honor one another's religions and faiths. And I mean, on a personal standpoint, every time I learn about someone else's religion or faith, in India, every time I was in someone's home, I grow as a human being, and I see, and I'm bettering myself every single time I hear a difference of opinion, or, I love to disagree with someone because I think that disagreement is just simply me growing. So I see all these people coming together in one room and listening to each other's different opinions and different faiths, and in that 1 hour, 2 hour meeting, all these human beings are growing kind of as a community, and then going out into their larger community as a whole and spreading that knowledge and spreading that respect. So it's pretty cool.
Thank you.
So this might come out really confusing, but I'm wondering how often people who are agnostic engage in pluralism, just because, and I obviously...
That's an excellent question.
I can't speak for everyone, but I feel like people who are agnostic and who practice religions are the ones who need this concept the most, because, like, personally, I'm Catholic. I'm not practicing, but I'm Catholic, and so since I understand the belief in something that a lot of people can't believe in, I understand other religions having that same kind of belief, something that can't be whatever proven. So I honestly think people who are agnostic, like, this would be the most powerful thing for them, and people who are religious to understand where they're coming from, them coming together and trading information. So I'm wondering if many of those types of people ever engage in this practice.
I don't know. I don't know. I'd love to have an answer. Jordan?
I would say yes, because that's what I'm doing here.
Okay. So you're engaging in agnostic pluralism.
Yes. So I would say that there definitely are a lot of people, because I have a lot of friends who also don't practice any religion and are also interested in having these conversations. But on a larger scale, I'm not entirely sure, but it does happen.
Because I think that would, I feel like would be the most beneficial, would be people who practice religions understanding why certain people don't, and people who don't, giving them the benefit of the doubt, saying, I'm not going to judge you anymore for practicing something I don't believe in.
Yeah, we're talking about 775 million people in the world. 1 out of every 8 people have no religion, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're agnostic or atheist, but they identify with no religious group. So that's a significant percentage of the world, and a significant percentage of people that live in the West Coast. So, I saw Alden.
I appreciate Tara bringing that up, because you're right, it is a huge population, and I think that while building community between all these different religions is so important, building community as a whole and including everyone is also important, which is why I just like the pluralism concept as a general model for life and for multiple groups, for people, for even human services and bringing in different organizations. I like the idea of an open forum of understanding where you're coming at it in that positive, proactive way that is understanding, not necessarily prevention, which is I think where we come at things very often with that intervention, prevention focus to prevent conflict or violence, etc. So I think that this could be applied in many, many ways.
Thank you. Pedro, you get the last word, and then we're going to take a break.
Okay, so well, I agree with Tara in a certain way, but also like I want to say that I have friends that are agnostic, and they're willing to listen and they're willing to engage in conversations about what like religions and stuff like that. I think that another thing would be there's also the other extreme, which is and we can see it sometimes on campus where there's people that really don't want to engage in conversation and pluralism. They want to make sure that my God is better than your God, and they force people sometimes. They kind of like put it like right there, just like and I think that's when people start kind of closing themselves up, because they're being kind of forced in a way to do like or believe in something that maybe not a lot of them believe. So, and I think that like I see the both extremes, the ones that are close to open to pluralism, because you just don't want to like hear or have a conversation about other religions because that's against my religion to you. So I think pluralism can be both ways, but I think it's important also to kind of like talk about it within our religions and how we can just educate ourselves about it.
That's a good point. But the key concept of pluralism is this fostering of understanding and dialogue and relationship. And if you inadvertently or consciously attempt to put people off, either with a too aggressive stance or an inflammatory, that's not pluralism. That's kind of the old way of my way or the highway. And with pluralism, what I like about it is it forces you to continue to grow as a person, to understand your tradition, to be able to articulate your tradition in a thoughtful way, and it does foster both personal growth for yourself and a relationship building with other people.
So yeah, that's what I was referring myself to. Like, for example, there's a couple of times where there's this guy. The amphitheater, and he's dressed in in white suit and stuff, but he's like yelling stuff stuff like that, and a lot of my friends close themselves up. They don't want to talk about it because they don't want to talk about any religions now because of that person. And I was like, well, that's not okay. I mean, just because one person is doing doesn't mean that everybody's gonna try to do something.
And that guy's been here as long as I've been here, and I've been here for 33 years. And maybe it was a different guy, but he dressed the same way when I was in graduate school, and that was 1975. And
So he has the right to be there. So don't you think?
He's getting something from it. So, well, let's take a little break. Richard Lariviere will be here in a couple of minutes, and I want to make sure that we warmly greet him because he's taking important time. President Lariviere will be here in a couple of minutes, but I actually had a question that I wanted to ask you that I didn't have time to ask you. So I think this is a good small group question. Now the question is, what skills have you learned as a human service professional that will be transferable to religious pluralism? So what skills do you have in terms of interacting with so-called clients that would facilitate a more reflective, sensitive, non-threatening, non-judgmental, engaged relationship with pluralism? So if you guys could just get twos and threes, talk about what skills do you have that could be transferable to this area of pluralism. Okay, let's see if we can get a little inventory here. What are some of the skills that you've learned as a human service professional that are transferable to this process of religious pluralism? We'd like to get a list, and then we're going to start playing with that list as the quarter goes on in terms of attempting to understand what it is that we can possibly add to this dialogue. So, Richard.
I have a couple difficult questions, and I don't know what you think. So, you are a human services worker, and you've traveled the world. I was explaining to them that as I lived in Canada, I love my emphasis beyond the religion. I love human beings. I don't care which religion they have. But we're taking subway every time to go to work in Toronto. And then there's these people who, because Toronto is like all people from all over the world. You will find like this is not even like North America because there's all diversity. So in this kind of religion, the people of that kind of religion who, when every time I take a subway, they put on fragrance on the body. I do love them, nothing against religion, but I was about to throw out. So it was so strong that every time I go, I say, I just love these people, but I don't know how I can. It's hard, I don't know, because how I can do. So my question was, the kind of person come in your office, and this is your body reaction, nothing against those people who have a different kind of religion and where they use some kind of fragrance and so forth. What will you do?
What do we do? What do we do when we're interacting with people in a human service context and they have fragrance or body odor or whatever? What's the basic rule that we follow in human services? Pedro.
I think you got to see it as open mind, I say, because there's a lot of people that, especially in the human services, I think it's very important to not go with whatever makes you feel comfortable, because it's not usually the point. The point is to work with resistance, work with that person that probably, work with their environment. For example, if you have a person that, it's really, that doesn't feel comfortable, and like we talked about it, when, going to the office, or maybe they want to meet someone else, go and meet someone else, because that's where they feel comfortable, and you have to meet them there. You have to go and meet the person at that level.
So we learn to individualize our communication
Yes.
for each person. Oh, and look at this. Oh, well, we're going to continue this conversation, but right now we have a very special person who's going to sit right next to me.
All right.
Welcome. Well, no, we're educators. We have the ability to be nimble, and this is your. This is your.
Thank you.
And so I was going to offer a short introduction to my neighbor.
That's true.
President Richard Lariviere is a eminent Sanskrit scholar. If you ask him what a Sanskrit scholar does, he'll be able to answer you in more than simple words. He studied and worked in India and in around the world for the past 25 years. And Carrie and I had the good fortune of hearing him speak at the Interfaith Breakfast in Eugene, Springfield, on the topic of Dharma and Karma. So he's a scholar, a thoughtful person. He's interacted with people throughout the world. And we are just so happy that he's here. And so let's please warmly welcome President Richard Lariviere.
Well,
and with that,
thank
you're
you.
on.
I apologize for being late. I was in a faculty meeting, and they tend to run a little longer than you might expect sometimes. So I'm delighted to be here with you. Well, I've looked at your syllabus, I wasn't able to get on Blackboard and look at your reading, so I don't know the exact assignment that you gave for Hinduism. What was it?
It was a compilation of a variety of both kind of historical and popular versions of Hinduism.
Okay. Well, you're probably fairly familiar with at least parts of the Hindu tradition, so let me do this. I'm going to talk to you about karma and dharma and how they fit into the world of thought in the Indian tradition. But I'd really be grateful if I say something or allude to something that or raise a question in your mind if you just ask me. Don't be shy about that if you wouldn't mind. India has given rise to Hinduism, however you may define that, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. Those are the four indigenous traditions that have survived into the modern era. Sikhs, as you may know, are the fellows who wear the turbans. They have top knots, and they all have a steel bangle and carry knives and so on. They're highly visible. There are very many more Christians in India than there are Sikhs. There are Muslims in India in significant numbers. About 16% of the population of 1.1 billion are Muslims. It's a very pluralistic religious environment. And if any of you are Sikhs or are Muslims, you're going to have to just bear with me for a moment. All of these traditions, including the Christian tradition, are shaped by these notions of karma and dharma. Now, karma, which is K-A-R-M-A, you know the word, is a Sanskrit word that simply means action. And dharma, D-H-A-R-M-A, is a Sanskrit word that's very difficult to translate. It is the word that is used in contemporary Indian languages for religion, but it's really quite misleading to translate dharma as religion. Dharma means something like one's duty to fulfill your share of the world's obligations. Not a handy or mellifluous poetic definition. Every single one of us in this traditional Indian view has a set of obligations that are determined by our status, our age, our gender, and most importantly in the Indian context, the family into which we have been born. Now, these notions of karma and dharma are very closely associated with the Hindu tradition. In fact, if you stopped anybody on the street in India and said, are these Hindu ideas or are they Christian ideas or whatever, everybody would just laugh at you and say they're Hindu ideas. But they're so predominant, they're so much a part of the fabric of thought in India that everyone has, if not appropriated them, at least adopted them. And it's the overarching sense that every action that we engage in, and by that I mean every single action, has a moral dimension to it. There's a right way and a wrong way to do everything. But what's the right way for me to do something isn't necessarily the right way for you to do something, because we're different people. I'm older, you're a student, I'm a teacher, I'm of such and such socioeconomic class, you're of a different socioeconomic class, and your Dharma is specific to you. There's a very, very famous verse in the Bhagavad Gita that says, it is better to do one's own Dharma badly than to do another person's Dharma well. And this is where Judeo-Christian audiences begin to get a little uneasy. Because if you're born into a family of thieves, it's your Dharma to be a thief. And you must be the best thief that you can possibly be. And there's a right way and a wrong way to be a thief under this worldview. Now, for most of us who are raised in a Judeo-Christian context, there's an absolute about morality and correctness and virtue and right and wrong, etc., that would make the notion of being a good thief versus a bad thief kind of peculiar. But in particularly the Hindu tradition, and by extension, I'll talk about that in a moment, for the rest of these traditions, this notion is so pervasive that to deny it would be a little bit like you and I denying the law of gravity. We could build a worldview around it in theory that denies that there is such a thing as gravity. But for all of us in the experience of our lives, we'd be continuously running into evidence that there really is such a thing. Well, the notion of karma and dharma is as pervasive an idea in India. If you do something, there is going to be a consequence for that act. Could be good, could be bad, could be immediate, might be in your next lifetime, if you believe in reincarnation. But there is always a moral consequence to your action. And it's incumbent on you as a responsible citizen of the universe to know what your Dharma is. If we all performed our Dharma, fulfilled our obligations perfectly, the universe would suddenly take on a happy state that would be near perfection. It's unachievable. None of us ever fulfills our Dharma perfectly. Some of us do a better job than others. And in those traditions that believe in reincarnation, that's what determines how you are reincarnated. So if you do your Dharma perfectly or extremely well, you will be reborn into a quote-unquote better circumstance. A wealthier family or a better educated family, whatever. And if you do this for several hundred millions of rebirths, and you're continuously on this progress, you may ultimately achieve enlightenment, which is an outcome that ceases this round of rebirths. You escape this world of woes and you are liberated. And the terms for this are deliberately vague because all of the philosophers who talk about this say, well, we're going to tell you now about something that is ultimately indescribable. It's ineffable. It can't be talked about. So how the hell do you talk about something that can't be talked about? Well, that's the history of Indian philosophy for several centuries, is trying to do that. That's true on an individual basis. So we all have this Dharma, and our actions, our karma, and they are, you will act, you have no choice but to act, will result in fulfillment or failure to fulfill that Dharma, and we have a consequence. So there's an individual dimension to this moral dimension to the universe. But so is there a collective dimension to the moral dimension to the universe. And in the Indian context, it's easiest to talk about this in terms of caste. Do you know this word caste? C-A-S-T-E? Anybody not familiar with that term? Well, that's a Please raise your hand if you're ignorant. Yes, yes, hello. What a way to, that's the wrong pedagogical strategy. I should say, how many of you are absolutely certain you know what caste means? Ah, there we go, all right.
I'm a member of the scheduled class.
Ah, there you are. Caste is a Portuguese word, casta. It's from a Portuguese word, casta, which means basically breed. It's the word you would use for dachshund or German shepherd or whatever to distinguish among dogs or certain species of horses, etc. You get the word breed. And when they encountered the social organization of India, they saw a structure in society that involved, that had as its focal point marriage. This is where caste really comes into play. You will marry within your caste in India, otherwise there's hell to pay socially. And so the Portuguese thought this had to do with breeding, and somehow so they just used this word for it, and we have adopted it. The Sanskrit word for caste is jati, which means birth. So the circumstance into which you are born is determined by your gender and your caste. Better to be a male, unfortunately, in this patrilineal, for the most part, patrilineal society, and better to be in the castes that have a higher ritual status. Now, the important thing here is a higher ritual status. It's not a socioeconomic issue. We tend to think of Boston Brahmins as well-educated, rich elites. The term Brahmin simply means the priestly caste, and they are not usually very wealthy. In fact, they're usually quite poor, but they have excellent educations, and they are the repository of learning and knowledge, etc. And each of those Brahmins, who are at the top of the caste hierarchy, has a Dharma, but there's a collective Dharma for that entire caste. So if this were a village setting, and we were to imagine that we were roughly equally divided in terms of our numbers as representing 4 or 5 castes, and there are literally hundreds of castes in India. This group here, who are the Brahmins, have individual dharmas to fulfill, but they also have an obligation collectively to collectively be good Brahmins. So it's not as if one of you can simply do your duty and the others can say, ah, to hell with it, I don't care how I'm born next. You all have an obligation as members of that caste to keep one another in line, to see to it that you're fulfilling your Dharma. So there's a social dimension to this, a social pressure to this that's very important. This group, on the other hand, are, I'm sorry to tell you, the people who clean latrines, the untouchables. You are at the very bottom of the socioeconomic class. You, however, also have a Dharma to fulfill individually and also collectively. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you decided that you didn't want to be a latrine cleaner anymore. You found it somehow objectionable, and you really wanted to be someone who performed rituals and studied the classical texts, etc. Turns out you're really smart. You can memorize these texts really quickly. You're really gifted in this area. What's going to happen to you? First thing that's going to happen to you is the rest of your fellow caste members are going to be very unhappy with you, because they have a collective duty to make sure that you fulfill your share of this collective Dharma, this collective responsibility. And these people are going to be really unhappy with you because your ritual status is so much below them, and for you to aspire to their work can be fatal. And particularly in northern India, you see these kinds of conflicts all the time, power conflicts between castes. And it's almost always based on economic interests, but it's articulated in these ritual terms. So maybe you've accumulated a little money and you loaned it to one of these people and you ended up owning their plot of land. even though you're ritually impure, you might be a good business person, you saved money, somehow you earned it. This person isn't happy about that, so will raise a hue and cry that says, you have insulted the ritual status of the Brahmin community and you deserve to die. It's a very extreme case, but it happens with surprising regularity in India. Not in large numbers, but it's in the media at least once a month, that kind of interchange. Now, so this gives you some sense, I hope, of the splits, the segments of society. In caste identity, caste discrimination is illegal in India. It has been since 1947, since independence. It's constitutionally prohibited. And there is no one in India, born and raised in India, who cannot tell you what their caste is. And there's almost no one in India who can't meet another Indian and tell you what their caste is. Now it gets trickier the further away from your home village you get. But I've been, as Professor Close said, I've been to India many, many times in the last too many years, almost every year since 1972. And one of the very common questions I get when I'm in a village is, what's my caste? They can't quite make sense of me. I can speak Hindi. I seem to know my way around the culture a little bit. But man, I'm a weird-looking Indian. And they know I'm not an Indian, but after a while, a certain degree of familiarity, they will simply come out and say, what is your caste? And what they're really asking is, how do you fit into the social hierarchy that they're living in? And that has given rise to some really bizarre and comical conversations that we talk about in another context. But caste is a very important definer. Now, it's a Hindu phenomenon. Everybody says it's a Hindu phenomenon, but Christians have it. They don't call it that, but certain subsets of Christian communities will not intermarry with others because, and they'll tell you all the reasons why that's the case, and they are exactly the same reasons, without using the word caste, they're exactly the same reasons that Hindus will use about why they don't intermarry among castes. And Muslims have the same kinds of social stratification. It's not called caste, and Muslims get really bent out of shape when they get accused of having this traditional Hindu hierarchy structure to their society, but it's there. And the real test for this is marriage. So I have very, very good friends who are quite westernized and sophisticated and aren't religious, poo-poo all of this stuff. But when it comes time for their little girl to get married, they want them to marry within the caste. And it's not that they buy into the characterization of karma and dharma that I gave to you. It's not that they're saying it's my dharma that I must marry into this caste. But it's so pervasive an idea that this is how things must be, that in certain circles, it's as weird to come and say, I want to marry these two communities, a member of each falls in love with one another. It's as alienating in particularly village India as a child coming home and saying, you know, I've fallen in love with my horse and I want to marry my horse. You know, you love this child, you want to make sense of this, but everybody's going to think you're goofy. I think you're goofy. You can't do that. It's not quite as bizarre as that, but it's very close to that. Now, there are people, it's 1.1 billion people, there are many people, many of whom have extensive Western experience, for whom this isn't true. They will have married across caste lines, across community lines. Hindus marry Muslims, etc., etc. But they will tell you that they have done this in the face of social objection to that marriage. It's not all that different than the relationship between blacks and whites when I was growing up. There were blacks and whites who married one another when I was a child, but they were socially ostracized. It was unacceptable. It was unthinkable. Luckily for your generation, this has changed so fundamentally that it's, I think, hard for you to imagine how strange that was. I hope it's hard for you to imagine how strange that was. Yes?
So, does that caste in India has to do with the skin color? Some who are dark or white?
No,
Okay.
it does not.
Okay.
Having said that, there are canons of beauty that are unrelated to caste that prefer fair skin. So if you read the matrimonial ads in the Sunday papers in India, and I urge you to do that, go online. You don't even have to go to the papers. Just go online and look for matrimonial ads, India. Google it. And up will come descriptions of homely Indian girl, age 26, height 70 centimeters, weight so many kilograms, green card holder, MIT educated, Sikhs, so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so boy, caste no bar. That means we're willing to entertain any caste. Or they will, first thing they will say is, Aurora, Punjabi girl with the same description. That's Aurora is a caste name, and that means if you're not an Aurora, don't bother to apply. Look at those matrimonial ads. It'll give you some sense of that. A homely girl, by the way, is not somebody who's not attractive. It's somebody who can cook well, keep a home, so they're homely. But it's often the case that they'll describe that girl as fair. So there is a bias in favor of fairness in terms of light skin color, but it's not related to caste. Now let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that we are no longer in a village, but we're now in an urban setting with the same caste distributions that we had. We've got merchants, we've got laborers. Yes? Yeah.
Should I ask?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. I'm curious how a Hindu makes sense of the caste system, and I don't mean this as an attack, I'm just very confused because I'm reading here that, let me see, some moral ideals in Hinduism include nonviolence, I'm just reading a few, friendship, compassion. So I'm wondering how those morals and ideals are upheld when they regard the caste system.
Yes,
or
great
they
question.
might choose violence in response to someone.
Great question. Do you know the Bhagavad Gita? Have you heard of it?
Very vaguely.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's, the translation of that is the Song of the Lord. And it's for those of you who have read it, you know that it takes place on a battlefield. And it takes place mostly in a chariot. The chariot is inhabited by a prince of a royal family who's going to war with his cousins and uncles over the kingdom that's at stake. And his charioteer is Krishna, the god Krishna. It's not clear whether the prince knows that Krishna is God or not. He will find out eventually, but at the beginning of this, it's just kind of ambivalent. He's just this charioteer, which is a pretty low enterprise. It's not a very distinguished task. The Bhagavad Gita opens, here is a warrior. He's of the warrior caste. He's there. The epic has brought us to this great battle. He looks out and sees his cousins, this uncle, this kid that he grew up with, arrayed on the other side, and he drops his weapons and says, I can't fight. This is my family, for God's sakes. And Krishna says, you're a warrior, you got to fight. And Arjuna, the prince, says, I can't, I'm going to kill my uncle. What will that do in terms of karma and dharma? What will be the consequence for me? And Krishna says, you are a warrior, it's your dharma to fight. Fight. And then he goes on for 18 chapters explaining this to Arjuna, who's not the brightest bulb in the marquee. And every time at the end of every chapter, Krishna takes a different tack to explain this, why he must fulfill his Dharma, in spite of a kind of pervasive morality of the sort that you're alluding to, where nonviolence is good and friendship is good, etc. But you are a warrior and you must fight. And Arjuna can't make sense of that, and he finally says, you've got to tell me. And Krishna says, don't worry about it. I'm Krishna, and I'm telling you, you must fight. And he says, if you're not smart enough to understand this, because not everybody is, just understand that I am a deity. And I'm telling you what's best for you because you're not smart enough to know this on your own. Arjuna says, okay, I think I've got it. It's pretty good, yeah, right. Beginning of the next chapter, Arjuna says, hey, you know, I've been thinking about this, and I'm not sure that that's going to work for me. Finally, in chapter 11, in the chariot, Krishna turns himself into the entire universe and shows the entire universe to Krishna. To Arjuna, sorry. Turns back into the individual who's driving the chariot, and he says, now do you get it? And Arjuna says, I get it now. And then at the beginning of chapter 12, he says, well, I got it when you were the universe, but now that you're not, I'm not so sure. And he never, ever finally comes to terms with this command, but he does fight. So he goes out and fights, but he's never comfortable with it. And there's this tension all the time in particularly the Hindu philosophical tradition. We can talk about that if you want. I want to give a little more of the setting of how caste comes to play, particularly in contemporary India. Let's go back to this. We're no longer in the village, but we're now in Eugene, the equivalent of Eugene, with university people, and we're sophisticated, pretty well off. The economy is good. Even these untouchables are making good money. Not just cleaning latrines anymore, but there's a whole range of activity that has been kind of set aside for them. They're rolling in the dough. And they're getting kind of sick of this status as latrine cleaners. In fact, nobody's cleaned a latrine for a couple of generations. They're in the meat processing industry or the leather working industry or whatever, and they're making good money. It may be, and it happens fairly frequently, that this group, as a group, gets together and says, we are no longer going to do any of those things that people have made fun of us for doing anymore. We're not going to eat meat anymore. We are not going to allow our women to go around without their heads covered anymore. We are going to behave much more like these people. We're not going to claim to be these people, but we're going to behave like they are. And we're therefore going to raise collectively our status socially by behaving in a way that imitates high status people. We're still going to be, somebody says, hey, Mr. Latrine Cleaner, we'll answer to that. But we'd rather call ourselves the leather workers or representatives of the leather industry. That's what we're going to call ourselves. That will be our new caste name amongst ourselves. And when somebody asks us what our caste is, we're no longer going to say we're going to say we're representatives of the leather industry. Now, none of us, the rest of us, know what that caste representative of the leather industry is. We know latrine cleaners, we know Brahmins, we know warriors, we know merchants, but we don't know this new category. And it has been the case in contemporary India that people have successfully elevated their caste to a higher status, a higher ritual status, simply by changing their name and changing their behaviors. And when I talk about this consciousness of caste, what I mean is that in our community, I know whether my caste is higher than yours. I know how your caste fits into the hierarchy of theirs. But when we've got this new category, that we don't know about. Now we just look and see, well, what do they do? And that's, here we are with karma. What is it that they do? Well, women cover their heads, they don't eat meat, etc. They must be pretty high caste. And they've changed their status. And then along comes the Indian government. And they say, not only is caste illegal to discriminate on the basis of caste, but we are going to engage in affirmative action. And if you think we've got aggressive affirmative action programs in this country, it is a joke and puny compared to the affirmative action in India. Fully 50% of the seats in many universities are reserved for people from scheduled castes. That is, there is a list in the government of castes that have historically been at the very bottom of the hierarchy. I'm sorry to keep putting you people in that category. But you've just been raised, so don't worry about it.
They get 50% of the seats.
So now they've got 50% of the seats at a university. Maybe 30% of the jobs in state government are reserved for these people. And you understand the principles of affirmative action. It's to endow people with opportunity who have been traditionally denied those opportunities, and to give them a leg up and to rectify centuries or millennia of discrimination and denial of social justice and equity. Well, imagine for a moment that you are a representative of the leather industry and you are pretty high-ranking, and you look at this list that includes all the names of castes that have traditionally been discriminated against, and half of the seats at university are available to the children of those castes. And sure enough, on that list are the latrine cleaners. Now what do? You have as a community, you have successfully elevated your status, but there are huge economic and social incentives that you are denied because of the changed status that you have. There is a caste in India called the Nadars, N-A-D-A-R, who are traditionally toddy tappers. That is, the people who climbed the trees, made the scar on the young coconut branch, so that coconut fruit, so that the juice drips into a tin and it ferments naturally up there, and periodically they go up and empty out the toddy and empty out the juice, and it's a natural alcohol. Utterly awful stuff. It's sold as arak in South India, A-R-A-C-K. If somebody offers it to you, tell them that you're a teetotaler. These people were very low caste, and they had a nickname that was utter anathema to them. They were called, it has the same impact on their community that the word nigger does on African Americans. I mean, you can start a fight by calling them this nickname. That nickname was on the scheduled caste list, but not the Nadars. And so now they were confronted with this terrific dilemma. Do we maintain, and they've raised their status. They had done exactly the phenomenon that I described. They've raised their status to sort of a middling level category. In fact, one of the richest men in India is a Nadar, a very, very good friend of mine. He's a multi-billionaire. And so far removed from toddy tapping that I don't think he would, I'm not even sure he knows that they were toddy tappers at one point. Doesn't matter for him because he's so rich he doesn't need any of these affirmative action things. But for the people who are just eking out a living, which is most of the people in India, this is a big deal. These affirmative action things are big deals. So you've got this tension that comes not only for this community that has so successfully raised themselves, but imagine the Brahmins and the warriors who are cut out of half the seats at a university, 30% of the jobs in the state, are closed down to their families because they're not on that list. And this exacerbates the tension between castes and has created enormous problems, legal problems, social problems, moral problems in India that the Indian government is really struggling with. Because you might say, well, let's just stop doing that. Cut back the 50% reservation to 15%. How do you think that's going to go over with the population who are the beneficiaries of that 50%? And in a democracy, that's a big deal. And one of the things that India prides itself on, and rightly so, is that it is a very successful democratic society, in the sense that everybody votes. And very often the political discourse is around these caste distinctions. So one of the quickest ways to raise your status, of course, is to have the chief minister of the state be from your caste, with all of the attendant patronage that comes from that. And so you can vote en bloc for a particular candidate who is a member of the warrior caste or whatever, in the hope that your fellow castmates will be the beneficiaries. And so you've got, in addition to the socioeconomic split that you have from affirmative action, there's a political split as well. And there was an article, I didn't think I should have brought that. I just read it in this week's Science magazine, a letter to the editor. There had been an article in the previous week about science in India. And this letter to the editor said, "Thank you for this extremely interesting article on science in India, with its recommendations about how India can make a bigger impact in the scientific world. But until they do away with affirmative action, with caste preferences, and stop awarding seats in university based on caste identity instead of academic capacity, science in India will always be second rate." Whether that's true or not, who knows, but I found it very interesting that even in Science, which is with the journal of the National Science Foundation, American Academy of Sciences, is engaged in this question around affirmative action based on caste in India. Yes?
So I don't totally know how to ask this question, so help me.
Okay.
All of you maybe can. So what does it do for a society to identify the caste separation that India is maintaining or upholding? And to flesh out my question more, I guess when I hear you describe the system, I'm relating it a lot to globalism and racial divide in the U.S. or socioeconomic divide in the U.S. Like when I hear untouchables and I see it as a metaphor for America, I think of homeless people or people living in homelessness. So I'm wondering maybe one, is that a fair parallel to make between the two societies? And two, what does it do for a society to acknowledge the divide versus maybe in American society or Western culture to not acknowledge it as much, and how that might impact the society?
Well, I think you asked that very, very well. I mean, this goes to, if we bring it to something that I think we're all a little more familiar with, this goes to the question of affirmative action. Do you reify the centuries of discrimination against African Americans by saying that we will have a portion of our seats in university dedicated to remedying the collective social ills that we have created as a society? What better way to do that than by providing for those people who have been systematically and statistically and demographically, it's clear, denied these opportunities? And so I turn to you as a member of the African American community, the daughter of two professors, both of whom are heirs to oil lands in Texas, and I say, have I got good news for you? Here's a seat for you just set aside based on your race. It stinks because it denies everything that you bring to the table as an individual. It reifies the very discrimination that we're trying to remedy.
It's true.
Yeah.
And having said that, what the hell do you do about the fact that it is undeniable that you have segments of every society, and it's not just American society, every society, who have been systematically denied the opportunity to shape their own lives, social justice, equity, etc. How do you fix that? If you know, if you figure it out, will you let me know?
Sure.
Thank you. Yes.
So those seats that are reserved for those castes, do they get educated to get to that level, or do they just say, okay, you are a member of this people group and so forth, this is reserved for you and you qualify? Is there any academic qualification that those people can have?
From a university perspective, speaking purely from an academic perspective, I'm sure you can imagine how terrible a consequence there is to take that kid who's not prepared. The seat is there for that child, but she hasn't had adequate elementary school education. She's not from a family that has prepared for the kind of rote memorization that is required in a successful university environment in India. And you pluck that child in, you put them there, and you sit them next to the son or daughter of the warrior caste who has had all those advantages and is ready to go. Who do you think is going to succeed?
I think the one who has been gotten education and so forth, yeah.
And so it reinforces the bias, you see the pernicious side of that. But if you don't have that reservation, and you simply leave it open to those people who are adequately prepared, who have the outcome will be that scheduled caste member will never have a chance to participate. And this is the dilemma. And
it is a dilemma.
It is the dilemma. Now we don't have such a serious dilemma in this country yet, certainly not at universities like this, because we still are able to bring a minimum qualification to the table that says you have to be capable of succeeding. Now, if you're smart enough, you're hardworking enough, you're disciplined enough, but you don't have the math requirements, we can fix that. If you haven't had 2 years of English, of French or Spanish, we can fix that. We can remediate those specific deficits. But if you've never been in an environment where books were used, you can't read, you can't write, it is, in my view, it's immoral to say to that kid, you're of the right socioeconomic class or category for our society to make me feel better about this burden that we've got, you've got a seat here. You're going to fail and we'll mark you as a failure for the rest of your life, but you see the dilemma. Well, imagine if half the seats of a university are reserved and even only 10% of the students fall into the category we just described. You've got 5% of the student body who are miserable failures, and it's unfair.
So do you think that India that the recipe for failure in the future, because that will go build up and will collapse because the more...
Yeah. The problem with that is that thinkers have been predicting the collapse of Indian society for about 2,000 years. And it has my own view is that you can't remedy these things with affirmative action targeted at individuals who are members of a class. You have to say, all right, if historically this caste has been denied opportunity, we have to remedy that denial. How do we do that? The simplest and most effective way is elementary and middle school and high school education. If you address that problem, then that kid is free to compete with anybody else. The problem, of course, with that is when you're talking about 50% of the seats at a university, you may be talking about a few 100,000 places. If you're talking about K-12 education for the masses, you're talking about hundreds of millions of kids. And the scale is so daunting that people want to grasp at these simpler solutions that end up simply being social exacerbators rather than solutions.
I have a question that's slightly different. So, in terms of intercaste relationships of a service or helping or education or charity or whatever term you would use. How does that work? Do they stay within castes or do they go between castes? What is the role of the religious?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Concomitant with karma is a notion, a characterization of actions as being meritorious or sinful. Makes sense. As good or bad, meritorious or sinful. You can acquire huge amounts of merit to remedy your sinful acts by engaging in certain kinds of activities that meet this kind of overarching social norm. So feeding poor people, funding education for the downtrodden, for the untouchable family, whatever. That will give you merit. And there's a very interesting dynamic related to gifts in India. When I give a gift here, you are the if I give you a gift, you are the beneficiary of that gift. You have money or a trophy or something that I've given you. You gain from that. In India, it's actually the other way around. You do me a favor by accepting my gift. Because I get merit from giving a gift, but also in certain circumstances, I give you not the sin exactly, because that's too Christian a notion, but I give you the demerits that I've earned. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So when I accept your gift, I get the rice or whatever you're giving me, but I also get a little bit of the failure to perform your duty perfectly. And so I really am doing you a favor. And in fact, there's an interesting book on this called The Poison in the Gift that talks about this whole exchange. And one of the ways that people test caste hierarchies in villages is in food exchanges. So you would never accept cooked food from somebody who is of a lower status in the hierarchy from you, because you accept not just the food, but also a little bit of that ritual contamination. You might accept cooked food from somebody who's perfectly equal. And if somebody's just slightly below you, you would accept raw food, so uncooked rice. It's very interesting.
And about you would accept that?
Yes, absolutely, because you've got a pretty good chance that you're not only getting the rice, but you're also getting even that poorly done Brahmin's action is somehow going to be a little bit beneficial to you. And these notions of merit and sin have very specific words associated with them. And you'll ask somebody, why are you doing this? And they'll say, I'm doing it for punya. I'm doing it for the merit of this. And it doesn't mean like a merit badge for an Eagle Scout. It means I'm doing it because I'm going to really be the beneficiary of this. And so it contributes to philanthropical activity. But you would never engage in philanthropic activity through the United Way, because you give money to the United Way, you don't know who you're giving it to, you don't know who they're giving it to, the transaction isn't there. So it's got to be very much a hands-on kind of enterprise. Yes?
I'm going back to the affirmative action piece. I'm really curious because I wasn't so aware of that, and you say it was enacted the year of the independence, so it's been there for a while now. I mean, relative. And the statistics, I guess, I have a couple of different questions kind of regarding that whole piece, but the statistics is what's interesting to me. If there's 50% of these students coming in and out, I mean, the failure is there. Obviously, it's got to be there. And if it's continuous and it's not changing, then where is their justification in continuing to do so? You know, taking these children. I guess the second piece of this is knowing how important the family structure in India is, and how the consequence and how much you're looked down upon when you're taken away from your family. And even if this education, this great thing is gifted to you, and they say, here, sit in the seat, to be taken away from your family is a really, really, really big deal. And so the consequences, the ramifications of taking that child away from their community, what is their justification in continuing to do this over and over again?
You mean to take them away to university instead of leaving them in the village or whatever?
Yeah, in the village to do the labor work that will then benefit their family.
Because the status of being at university is very high, way higher than it is for you and me to be at a university.
But if they're failing, is my question, if the statistic is that they will fail.
Since Victorian times, when the British introduced business cards, calling cards where I don't know if I have, yes, I have Richard W. Lariviere, PhD on my card. It was a joke amongst the British, but absolutely common among aspiring Indians to put on their Richard W. Lariviere, BA failed. Because that meant I'd been to university. I didn't finish, I flunked out, but I had been to university. Have you been to university? No, you haven't. I have been. So that is worth putting on your business card all by itself.
Did you fail?
Yeah, even if you failed. Now, you don't see that very much anymore. And part of the reason is that because of the pressure that we are seeing of affirmative action, there has been a dilution of expectation, a dilution of requirement, such that there's been serious erosion of the quality of a BA in most Indian universities. Yeah.
I would imagine there's generational experience too. You know, if you're a first generational college student, it's
exactly.
going to be more difficult.
You're exactly right.
I would say that would be a good reason why you keep it going after generations, of even after failing.
That's right. And if you are of that untouchable class who took advantage, whose grandparents took advantage of these seats, succeeded, and you are now the third generation university attender, you're not going to put on there BA failed. You're not going to fail. And if you do, it's going to be a source of great humiliation and embarrassment, right? Yes?
Going back to the question, why not your question about saying taking the kid away from the village, that's very hard. Why not put a university or community college in the community where they are still in the community, not away from the family?
And that would be ideal. I mean, I'm sure you could answer, that's ideal, but because there's so many communities and there's so much need in India, and those communities are really widespread, especially the rural villages, there's so many and they're so far away, then where do you throw up this school and who's going to teach it? I mean, government schools, teachers are barely even trained.
That's exactly right. That very approach has been used in elementary education. So elementary education through third grade, I think, is required. I think they just changed it to 7th grade just last year. You know, they might as well say everybody should get a PhD because they don't have the capacity to even effectively educate kids through the 3rd grade. This is one of the great scandals. There are schools in every village. They build them. There's money has been made available. It's like Obama's stimulus money. It's good for the village. People get labor and they build this thing. And the kids might even show up there for a time. And somebody is being paid to be the teacher in that school. Of course, that person may live in New Delhi and be getting a check every month from the government, small amount, not very much, certainly not enough to induce them to move to that village. And there's a school and it's not working. And so you get this, you get a really dejected populace that says the government is corrupt, they can't educate our kids, to hell with them. As soon as I get enough money, I'm going to pay for my own child's education.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Congo, even if I'm now Canadian citizen. What they do, like in small villages, is that the government, because of civil war of years, can't provide for enough money to pay the teachers. So what they do is that the parent themselves pays the teachers. What they do is that, for example, $5 a month for your kid to go to school, they say, we have to do this on our own, and they work hard.
Yes.
With maybe agriculture and so forth to send the kid to school by paying the teachers. And these have been going on for years. And education, people are graduating because of that system.
The same phenomenon obtains in India. You can go into the most desperate slum outside of Bombay, where people just live in absolute poverty. And those families are setting aside a tiny fraction of their money every month and paying a pittance to somebody to teach their child, because education is so highly valued in the Indian culture. It's not much of an education, but it's better than nothing. I have to go. I just realized I've got probably a very cold and grumpy wife standing outside this building who's been wondering where I've been for the last several minutes.
Well, we so appreciate you, your wisdom, and your method of presentation, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for your time. Thanks for your questions. Thanks. See you. Thank you all.
So let's break up into groups, and let's each identify our Dharma, individual Dharma, and the collective Dharma of the group, and see where that leads us into a discussion of where we are and what we need to do.
I have no clue about the Dharma, right?
Well, remember, what Dharma is what your obligation is to fulfill the requirements of society. Okay? So those, does everybody have just a little bit of... Yeah, Dharma, principle of duty. And remember, it has an individual dimension and it has a collective dimension. So we are all here part of what? Family Human Services, 408, University of Oregon, Human Service Professionals. We're kind of the Human Services caste. And we're elevating our caste. So what I want you all to play with now is, what does that mean for you individually, and what does that mean for each of us collectively?
Is your Dharma supposed to be, like, selfless? Like,
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No, because remember, if you're a warrior, or if you're a leather salesman,
Or a thief.
but you have your individual responsibility and your collective. I just want you guys to practice this so that when we talk about it in the future in terms of, remember, karma is action, Dharma is duty. So just keep those ideas up there, and let's spend 10 minutes figuring out what's the collective and individual action that each of us need to do within this Hindu-Indian context. Okay? And then we'll finish up in about 15 minutes. Okay? You are awesome. You are awesome. Okay, we're going to kind of bring this all to a screeching halt. We have a collective vision of the class, finally. We are the caring caste. Okay? So our Dharma is caring. And our karma is what? What one karmic activity do each of you engage in to support the Dharma of the caring caste? Who feeds the poor? Who clothes the naked? Who teaches the children? Who works with the elderly? And see, that's, again, how they view it. If you're part of a caste or group that's responsible for the caring or the feeding or the teaching or the support or the medicine, then each individual has a very specific role. And each person in the caste takes special attention to make sure that every other person, that they do their own job and that everybody else does it too. So in a way, you have kind of a cohort model. You know, individual activities, peer pressure, whatever, set of standards, set of values. So if you think about those things as you take on assignment 2, with assignment 2 you're going to be doing some reading, you're going to check a website out, you're going to write a one-page, but try to add some of the dimensions that we've taught about today. We've talked about pluralism, we've talked about Hinduism, we've talked about Dharma, karma. So be creative. Don't think that there's a right answer to this, but try to create a sense that you understand that this Dharma is your duty. It's the duty to maintain the order. And they think of it as a cosmic order. But that your karma is really the actions that you need to engage in. And so I'm very much enjoying the level of dialogue that takes place. I thought you were very respectful with the president, asked great questions. And next week, we're going to have a professor of Judaic studies, Deborah Green, come and talk about Judaism. And that will be more of a traditional lecture context. She's quite a spectacular, flamboyant, very expressive person. I think you'll like her. The next week we'll have Rabbi Yitzhak Hankins' husband here, who's the chief rabbi at Temple Beth Israel, and really one of the key social promoters of human services. And I met him 30 years ago when our paths crossed in the human service area. So then he and I will do some work together. I also will have a lecture on the role of service in spirituality that I will present to you. They'll have some ideas that Richard presented today. So next week, more lecture, less discussion, but hopefully a lot of good engagement. The next week, really human service, how it all gets tied together. And then we move on to Christianity. And then we move on to Islam. So again, we're not going to stay on any of the religious groups very long. It's kind of a tour of Europe. You got England one day and France the next and Germany, each one interesting. I will not be here next week, so it'll be, again, more of a traditional lecture. I'm going to be taking my father-in-law to Monterey. He's an 86-year-old ex-bomber pilot, and so he's going to meet with some of his old friends from World War II in Monterey. So my wife and I are taking him. So I'll miss you next week, but I'll be here the following week.
I'd just like to thank you how you are conducting the class. It's really great. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm hoping you're as stimulated as Carrie and I are, because putting a lot of energy and excitement into it. But thank you all, and have a great week. And
enjoy your week.